is said to show that perception cannot arise in the mill or in any other material machine, a merely material machine, but present-day readers are hard-pressed to find an argument in this. So my point is just that Leibniz is making these claims, and people have found it difficult to see why they are claims for cognitivity in the case of immaterial things, as opposed to material things. But there is an argument from desire-like appetitions to the generally mental nature of perceptions, and one that's commonplace nowadays. Computers, thermocouples, and the like have physical, structural properties, as well as information-bearing properties. The former determine the latter. But only their physical properties and those of things around them play a causal role in their operations. A computer executes its programs by sending electrical current through a large number of chips, a causal process explained without reference to what a certain pattern of electrical flow might represent. So the semantic properties of machine states are relevant for explaining the functions the computer performs, but causally irrelevant to the production of its states. Recall Leibniz's remark that a person who buys a clock only needs to know it keeps time, but this is not enough for the person charged with maintaining it. This points to a crucial difference between a computer and a mind, it seems, as Colin McGinn puts it. Even if we set the computer up so that its symbols have meaning, it's still the case that the program instructions have nothing to do with these meanings. The trouble is that the machine never does anything because of what a symbol means. Yet this seems to be precisely what minds do. Nowadays, it is widely held that the semantic properties of mental states are causally relevant. That is, that the causal laws pertaining to mental processes cannot be stated without reference to what mental states represent, and this marks a difference between the explanation of the causally relevant properties in non-mental things. Now, this is true of monads if appetitions are essentially desire-like. For desires are intentionally directed to future ends, and desires are realized to the extent they produce effects that satisfy those ends. So laws of final causality of the sort which pertain exclusively to monads, as I'm thinking, might be expressed in the following way. It's on the handout. If monad M has perceptions which represent impending goods, E1, E2, E3, and so on, and has appetitions for those ends, then M changes to a state that realizes E1, E2, E3, et cetera, to the extent possible. So in stating that, I specified what's represented by the perceptions of the monad. Now, to be sure, a monad has modifications in virtue of which it perceives the thing it does, these modifications that have the expressive structure. They're analogs of the physical properties of a computer, so one might think they are the causally relevant properties of the monad. But I take it the doctrine that monads are governed by laws of final cause apparently implies that this isn't the case. It's final cause that explains the operations of monads. So either there are no general laws with regard to the effects produced by modifications, qua modifications, or if there are laws, they're not explanatory. They don't give the reason why appetites produce the effects they do. Further, one might argue that monads are not just mental in character, but explicitly cognitive. It is surely appropriate to ask how Leibniz explains the fact that perception of an attainable good is attended with appetite for that good. This is easy to explain in a rough and ready way if perceptual modifications present a monad with a world as if factual, being presented with a world as if it contains an impending desirable event, has an intelligible connection with raising something like desire for it. And indeed, Aristotle's De Anima offers an explanation of appetition along just these lines. On the handout number 8, while, however, intellect is always right, appetency and imagination may be right or wrong. Hence, it is invariably the object of appetency which causes motion, but this object may be either the good or the apparent good. So motion is caused by an object which is a kind of appearance of something as if good. That appearance might be right or wrong, but in any case it's intentional, it's a cognition, and it's the cause of action. Moreover, again from De Anima, sensing then is analogous to simple assertion or simple apprehension in thought, and when the sensible thing is pleasant or painful, the pursuit or avoidance of it by the soul is a sort of affirmation or negation. It is in this that actual avoidance and actual appetition consist. Nor is the appetitive faculty distinct from the sensitive faculty, though logically they are different. So appetition is a sort of practical affirmation of what is presented by sense, and the presentation by sense is a form of cognition. Well, I suggest that in Leibniz' theory of the monad, there is a more abstract but similarly explanatory connection among perceiving, appetition, and acting. To be sure, many monads lack imagination and lack sensory appearances, but I want to suggest appetites respond to perceptions of impending good as if they were correct, and appetitions are, well, really indicators. In the actual paper I said evidence, but they're indicators of the monad's acceptance of what's presented to it. My suggestion is that Leibniz subscribes to a version of Aristotelian psychological theory, pushed back to an abstract notion of cognition as mere presentation of a world as if factual. Cognition explains activation of appetite, and appetite explains what monads do. Now, work of John Carriaro takes note of this sort of argument, but suggests it has no grip in the historical context. It's undermined by the natural philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, he urges. The problem is that all substances, including even earth, air, fire, and water, have natures comprising powers organized around ends. So all causes have ends, natural terminations or goals. Now, Aquinas argues for this quite sweeping claim in the following passage, number 10. For every agent, the principle of its action is either its nature or its intellect. Now, there's no question that intellectual agents act for the sake of an end because they think ahead of time in their intellects of the things which they achieve through action, and their action stems from such perception. So, too, does the likeness of a natural resultant pre-exist in the natural agent, and as a consequence of this, the action is determined to a definite result. Therefore, every agent acts for an end. So fire, which naturally produces fire, has within it the likeness of fire. And in the same way, it would seem fire has an internal representation or likeness of its proper place in the universe, for it naturally rises. Moreover, Aquinas detaches the notion of appetite from its Aristotelian mooring in cognition. And I'll just kind of sketch his argument here as I understand it. I think it's actually on the handout, number 11. So the argument is, first of all, that inclination follows every form. If you've got a form, then you've got an inclination. Form is present in non-cognitive beings in an inferior way and present in cognizant beings in a superior way. In non-cognizant beings, form determines the nature of the thing and thus its natural inclinations, which are called natural appetites. Now, the rest of this passage, which Carriaro does not quote, draws an instructive contrast with cognizant beings, and I will return to it shortly. But Carriaro's point is that in the Thomistic philosophy, cognition is not required for agency, it's not required for desire of an internally represented good, and it's not required for acting. As he puts it, what is essential for Aquinas seems to be that the end shape or determine the agent's activity, not that it involve cognition. He suggests that goal-directed activity is the essential condition of substantial unity and agency for Leibniz as well. As he sees it, Leibniz's notion of a substance, its powers, and act is organized by an immanent end in the manner of the the Aristotelian theory. But as Thomistic theory shows, this sort of structure does not imply cognition. So quoting Carriaro, Leibniz's allusions to scholastic substantial forms and entelechies make it reasonably clear that he's trying to rehabilitate a notion of scholastic end-governed natural inclination, which was supposed to be a sort of end responsiveness that could be found in non-cognitive beings as well. So the way Carriaro sees it, Leibniz retains the desire-like nature of monadic appetition, but cuts the explanatory link between appetition and cognition, which has some precedent in Aristotle. Now, one can wonder how much authority Leibniz gives to Aquinas in the matter of what constitutes cognition. Descartes, you'll remember, remarks that gravity could not impel a body toward the center of the universe unless the body had within it some knowledge of the center. In fact, however, a closer look at the Thomistic theory of cognition is revealing. Aquinas argues for an explanatory connection between cognition and appetites of the sort that occur in monads. This is because monads have inner representations and have appetites significantly more, inner representations more and appetites significantly more, variable and diverse than the small number of appetites Aquinas ascribes to fire, earth, and the like. Of particular interest to us, Aquinas proposes a general account of what it is to be a cognizant being, which abstracts from psychological notions which plainly don't apply to monads in general, belief, memory, inference, consciousness, and the like. I have to say that in my account of Aquinas, I'm relying heavily on work of Robert Pasnow. So referring to that from Aquinas, a species is a form of a thing existing intentionally in some other thing. A cognizant being knows other things in virtue of receiving species of those things, having the forms in them in this particular way that's called intentional. For instance, an animal perceives a stone when its soul receives intentionally the form of the stone. When a kettle receives the form of heat, it becomes hot, but it has no perception of heat. But when the soul of a dog intentionally receives the form of heat, it perceives heat without growing warm. There's a great deal more to say about this, but I think that's enough to make my point. When it comes to distinguishing between cognizant and non-cognizant beings, however, it turns out that things are not so simple. Aquinas allows that forms of other things exist intentionally in the air and water when they convey species from objects to knowers, and he denies that intentional reception of forms in those things suffices for cognition. So Robert Pasnow accounts for this in the following way. Quote, I believe it is an implication of Aquinas' account that media in receiving forms intentionally are, from a theoretical perspective, participating in the same sorts of operations as are the properly cognitive faculties of sense and intellect. Intentional reception of forms is then necessary, but not sufficient for cognition. It happens in more things than the cognizant, but it has to happen in the cognizant. To qualify as a knower, a being must have a nature suited to have more complex forms than those present in air and water, not just scattered information to the effect that there's red here and heat there, but information structured to represent different bodies with various qualities and in mutual relations. So cognition is the capacity to receive intentional forms that reaches or exceeds a threshold. Cognition begins at a certain point on the scale of representational complexity. That's the interpretation urged by Pasnow. Now, without going into more detail, we can see important similarities in this account of Aquinas' view and Leibniz's doctrine that perception is expression in a monad. The expressive modifications of a monad represent, indeed, they're formally, structurally similar to things and events in the material world, and what they express is extremely complex. As Leibniz explains, quote, every substance expresses, however confusedly, everything that happens in the universe, whether past, present, or future, and has some resemblance to an infinite perception or knowledge. Now, to be sure, Aquinas' account ascribes cognition to things to which Leibniz would not.